This is Chapter 1 of Lord of the Flies.
Things have changed forever. Words can't take back all the things that you've done. And I'm not so sure if we can go on like this together. But from what you tell me, it sure sounded fun. Is he the right man? This thought just keeps running through my brain. How could I stand?
It's actually been a long time since I've done these videos, which is going to sound really bizarre because this is, of course, Chapter 1. But I won't go through all the details in terms of how all of these videos came to be, but a lot of them were shot out of order. And so this is actually one of the last videos that I've done in that Lord of the Flies series, which is, again, a little bit odd for you because this would have been probably the first time that you're seeing these videos. But when the pandemic hit, I actually started recording where my students already were in the respective novels for both my grade 10 class and my grade 11 class. And so here we are. And so that's why the background is going to look a little bit different than some of the other backgrounds in the rest of the videos. So this is, like I said, Chapter 1 of Golding's classic Lord of the Flies. And these videos are intended, of course, to be as helpful as possible to walk you through a classic like this. And the reason why we call it a classic is because of the enormous depth of a novel like this. And again, I won't go into too much detail because I really want to focus on a very, very hefty Chapter 1. But I will say that, much to the chagrin of a lot of parents and guardians of the students that I teach, a lot of them are, much to their chagrin, I'm still teaching a classic like this after all these years. And some of them don't remember the novel fondly. Whereas, some parents are actually happy that it's still part of the curriculum. So, for me, I have a really hard time replacing a novel like this with something else, just because of, like I said, the depth of a novel like this. It's a hard one to replace. And in a course like mine, which focuses a lot on human behavior, and what humans are capable of, a lot of good and a lot of not so good stuff too. It's a good piece of literature to analyze. So I'm going to get right into it, and because there's a lot to talk about. And so again, these videos are intended to be helpful. So pause it at any point or stop it at any point. Take your notes. You should have the novel in front of you and follow along with me. Maybe at this point you already have the first chapter read. Maybe you're being lazy and you're using my video reviews in order to get yourself through the novel, and I guess that's kind of okay, but you miss out on a lot of other stuff, of course. So you want to make sure that you're following along. You have your laptop in front of you maybe, and you are taking notes on your laptop, or you're kicking it old school and you have a piece of paper and a pen, and you're taking notes that way. However you need to take notes, take notes. I can't stress that enough. It's a lot of front-loaded work, but on the back end, when you have to start preparing for tests, assessments, and things like that on the novel, you will be golden. So it's really, really important to take notes. So again, this isn't supposed to be that kind of a lecture, so I'm going to get right into it and talk a little bit about this first chapter, because there's a lot to talk about, because there's just a great deal of depth. Even within the first couple of pages, as you'll see. So you'll see a lot of my other video reviews. I usually try and keep it around. Some of them are as short as 15 minutes. Some of them are, unfortunately, as long as about 30 minutes. This one, I can imagine, is going to be pretty lengthy, just because of the nature of this, first chapter. So let's get right into it. What you probably should know, of course, if you didn't know this already, about the novel is that it's a bunch of boys that are stranded on a deserted island, and it's taking place, in terms of setting, during an unnamed war, even though, of course, William Golding kind of sprinkles in some clues as to what war this could possibly be. And the ages of the boys range from about 6 years old to as old as 12. There's nobody that is described as being older than that. So it's kind of the age range that we're looking at. And in terms of how many boys, we have no idea how many there are. Of course, a lot of them get named, and we can assume that there are probably a lot of other boys on the island too that just aren't important enough to be given a name. So there's quite a few characters to be mindful of. And so, so what has happened here, without giving too much of the backstory, I guess, is the boys have been evacuated out of Britain, and their plane has been shot down, and they crash land on this, what they will soon discover is a deserted island. They're the only humans that are on this island. And so, of course, the idea is, how are they going to survive? And so where the novel picks up from is after the novel has, or after the plane has crash landed on the island, the passenger tube of the plane has kind of been swept out into the ocean, and we get two characters. You can see them on the PowerPoint here. Two characters by the name of Piggy and Ralph interacting with each other, and these are boys that are not friends. They're not familiar with each other. We get the idea that they don't even go to the same school. And so, yeah, they are the first two boys that we're kind of introduced to. So as you can see on the PowerPoint, kind of goes from, if you can't see it well enough, that plane actually says British Airways. And if you follow the arrow, of course, they crash land on a deserted island, and then the two characters that meet up with each other are Piggy, of course, represented by the piggy bank, and then Ralph from The Simpsons, which the Ralph in the novel, I should say, the Ralph in the novel does not look like Ralph from The Simpsons. Without going into too much sort of very specific detail, just start off by saying the boy with fair hair from the first line is in reference to our first character that we're introduced to, which is Ralph. And of course, if you're watching this and I'm your teacher, I always tell you to keep track of the characters, the setting, and the problem. And so the characters, you want to make sure that you can keep track of who they are. And of course, Ralph and Piggy are going to be two of the main characters in the novel. So you want to make sure that you have a good understanding of who they are. So you might want to just, again, keep track, put boy with fair hair, Ralph, maybe have another column for Piggy when we get his description and so on. And then you can just keep coming back to it and keep adding to that list, as the novel goes on. So what you'll kind of notice even from the first page is when Ralph and Piggy interact with each other, the first thing that you'll notice is that Ralph does something kind of interesting here, which is that he doesn't really want to associate with Piggy. And so this is already one of the first kind of below the surface things that I want to talk about, when we talk about the depth of the novel, because what we're seeing here is what we would call conscious versus subconscious thought. Now, you need to know that Piggy and Ralph look physically different from each other, very different, drastically different. When we get that description of Ralph in a couple of pages, Ralph is somebody who is, first of all, he's 12 years old, so is Piggy, and Ralph is already transitioning into his teenage body. He's losing the baby fat, he's getting the broad shoulders, he says he's got, kind of average to nice looking face, good looking boy. But yeah, he's starting to get that teenage body where he's kind of developing. Piggy, on the other hand, is very different. He's kind of the opposite. He still has the baby fat. He's very chubby, to the point where eventually, of course, the boys are going to pick on that. So he's overweight. He wears glasses. He's asthmatic. There's a lot of things about Piggy that make him a bit of an outcast, which I'll cover in this chapter and then in some of the videos to come. So yeah, they're drastically different from each other. And so even though Ralph and Piggy have experienced this really, and of course the other boys too, have experienced this really tragic and terrifying event of their plane crashing, you would think that the first thing that all the boys would do is congregate together, is to find others and come together. And what you'll notice in the first couple of pages is Ralph is very disinterested in befriending Piggy, and befriending, of course, to become friends with. So is not really wanting to associate with Piggy until much later in the chapter, actually. And so why is that? And so consciously, we could think about it as Ralph is looking at Piggy being like, this kid is fat. You know, he's asthmatic. He doesn't know that he's asthmatic at this point, but he's wearing glasses. This is not somebody that I want to associate with. That's conscious thought, because that would be Ralph actively thinking about that in regards to Piggy. Subconsciously, it's very possible that Ralph also is thinking those same thoughts, but doesn't even know that he's thinking it. That means deep down inside, or in the very far back of Ralph's head, he's thinking to himself, this kid is fat, he wears glasses, he's going to slow me down. I don't want to befriend somebody like this. And so you have to think, if you put yourself in Ralph's shoes, is Ralph thinking to himself, this kid is going to slow me down, I don't want to be friends with him, look at what he looks like? Or do you think that that's more of a subconscious thought? It's in the back of Ralph's mind. Because again, if you pay attention to the first couple of pages, Ralph doesn't even want to talk to him. And at one point, which I'm going to focus on in a moment, Ralph actually tries to pick up in pace and actually kind of get away from Piggy. Which again, given their situation, is so unbelievably bizarre. So Piggy tries to get Ralph's attention. I'm going to try and pick up in pace here a little bit. So here's what I'm talking about. Is Piggy here is, and I'm only on, in my version anyway, which is this version here, I'm only on page 2 here and into page 3, that Piggy is actually trying to talk to Ralph and try and almost immediately make a plan for how they're going to, of course, survive, and what their next steps should be. And immediately Piggy really seems to understand the severity of their situation. Now Ralph, on the other hand, this is where, there's that concept that I talked to my class about, which is called the proximity between characters. And you see this not just with William Golding, but you see this with authors all the time, which is where characters, when I talk about proximity between characters, it's actually the spacing between one character to another. Where are they situated in relation to each other? And where I want you to focus on that is, there's a couple of different areas in this particular chapter, but in this particular scene, Ralph is walking in front of Piggy. And so usually what I say to my students is, if you think about this and put themselves in this situation, is if you're walking in the hallways at school with your friends, you walk side by side because you're equals. You don't walk down the hallway with one person in front of another. That's really bizarre. So what this indicates to us that Ralph is walking in front of Piggy is that already Ralph has established himself as a leader and Piggy as a follower. One as superior and one as inferior. And so just by having one character walk in front of another, already William Golding has set up that dynamic of superior, inferior, follower, or leader, follower. And you'll see that come up many times throughout this chapter. On page 3 is again where you notice that Ralph is incredibly disinterested in getting to know Piggy. And what I'm talking about that is Piggy asks what Ralph's name is, to which Ralph, of course, says Ralph. And it actually says that Piggy's kind of waiting for Ralph to also say, well, what's your name? Like any normal person would do. And Ralph doesn't even ask what Piggy's name is. So could you imagine when you introduce yourself to somebody for the first time, or you ask what somebody's name is and you're getting to know somebody and then they don't ask you anything about yourself, or they don't ask you what your name is? That's such a bizarre interaction. That's why I wanted to point that out. Piggy explains to Ralph that he has asthma, but of course with his accent, it's sounding like Asmar, and so Ralph kind of mocks him for that. It's very possible that they have a very different dialect, so Ralph throughout the novel will make fun of Piggy for that, but it always ends up being something that students remember, even though it's really insignificant. And yeah, so there's a line here, and of course I'm not going to be able to find it, where, like I said, where Ralph is actually trying to get away from Piggy. So within the first few pages, you'll see that Ralph actually, it says that he picks up in pace, that he actually tries to walk faster to get away from Piggy. Ralph ends up tripping and falling, and Piggy's able to kind of catch up to him. But Piggy doesn't even realize that Ralph is trying to get away from him. So those are some really small things where if you're really not an educated reader, and it does take practice and it does take a lot of reading to become a better reader, you miss out on those very subtle things. Good. As you can see, in the first few pages as well is, Piggy is really trying his best to come up with a plan. We should try and get to know everybody's names. Once we all kind of gather together, we should be kind of making a plan moving forward. And again, it's one of those things where Ralph isn't interested in that. The only time that Ralph becomes faintly interested in Piggy is when Piggy says, I don't mind what the boys call me as long as they don't call me what they called me at school. And that's where we find out that they used to call Piggy Piggy. And in fact, in this novel, we never actually find out what Piggy's name actually is, because that ends up becoming his the name that they call him. And we'll talk about that in this chapter as well. So that's when Ralph is kind of faintly interested in Piggy, because Ralph wants to know what the boys used to call him in school. And it's important to note that Piggy actually says here, so long as you don't tell the others, just don't tell the others what my nickname is. And it's a little bit of foreshadowing, because that's exactly what Ralph does. So we'll talk about that when we get there. The next little part that I want to talk about, like I said, there's a great deal of information. The next part that I really wanted to talk about is just how Piggy is described and how Ralph is described. And like I said, drastically different. Piggy, as you'll be able to see on the slide, so he's, like I said, he's overweight. He wears glasses. He's asthmatic. We find out that he can't swim. He wasn't allowed to swim because of his asthma and so on. So if you already think about Piggy's character and the setting of the novel, Piggy is already set up to fail. He's not somebody physically who is going to be able to survive in a place like this. And if he is going to survive, it's going to take a great deal of work and a great deal of help from others. So whether he gets that help or not remains to be seen. But he's already physically somebody that's not really set up for a place like this. But what you can tell from Piggy is that he's very smart. He's somebody that is trying to already think next steps. What are we doing next? Whereas Ralph, as you notice in the first few pages, which we're going to talk about in a moment, he's very much excited about being on his own. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then, like I already said about Ralph, and you can see on the slide as well, that again, even though the character of Ralph in the novel does not match up physically with Ralph from The Simpsons, it's in name only. The way that Ralph looks, like I said, is he's a 12-year-old boy that's already transitioning physically into his adolescent body. So the next thing to talk about, which is really, really important, is Ralph's behavior here. Ralph finds this, and this part's really, really important, is Ralph finds this kind of, obviously because there's no other humans, this very naturally made swimming pool. And he goes to go swimming. But the really important piece here is that when Ralph goes swimming, he takes all of his clothes off. He gets butt naked and he goes swimming. And so this is probably going to be one of your most prominent notes for this chapter, which is, of course, answering that question, which is why? Why would he take all of his clothes off? And there's a couple of different reasons for this. And again, I always tell my students and try and relate it to a scenario that would make sense for them, which is, of course, that if they themselves have a swimming pool, or they have friends that have swimming pools, you don't go over to their house, or you don't go swimming, and you take all your clothes off. Of course, you wear a bathing suit. And there's social reasons for that. But here, Ralph has decided to take all of his clothes off. And again, he's still in the presence of Piggy. He takes all of his clothes off and he decides to go swimming. The significance here is Ralph is, like I just finished mentioning, so excited about being free. He's so excited about the idea of being away from parents, guardians, police, civilization in general, and just the freedom that he feels from that. And it doesn't take, as you can see, very long for him to latch onto that idea of freedom, and therefore demonstrating that by removing all of his clothes. Now, if you think I'm crazy, you're going to see in a moment a scene that comes up that kind of solidifies this point, so that you don't think that I'm reading too deeply into it. But there is something to be said about the freedom from civilization that clearly, as Ralph and Piggy are looking around, they're not attached to civilization. There's no hospitals, schools, there's no big buildings, there's certainly no other people. And you kind of have that feeling like you are detached from civilization. And so therefore, if you are detached from civilization, then clothing is one of those symbols of civilization. We know that it's inappropriate to go out in public naked. That's why people wear clothes. That's a societal construct. And so it's almost like Ralph, when we talked about this term subconscious, subconsciously, maybe he's thinking to himself without realizing it, I'm not attached to civilization, and therefore clothes are not necessary. And so he ends up going swimming. We find out that Ralph can actually swim really well. We also find out a really key piece of information, which is that Ralph's father is in the Navy. And that may explain why Ralph is kind of carefree and not really taking stock of the severity of their situation of being stranded on this deserted island. That he just feels like any 12-year-old boy would, that eventually he'll get saved, and quite possibly from his own father. And so that's why he is, he's so carefree. He can go swimming. He's taking his clothes off, and he actually feels almost quite comfortable immediately landing on the island. Whereas Piggy is actually quite worried, and again, like I said, is thinking of next steps. How do we survive, and what are the next things that we should do? And like I said, there's a scene that comes up soon afterwards that will kind of solidify this whole idea that I'm trying to present here, which is, Piggy talks to Ralph. Wow, you can swim really well, and blah blah blah. We find out that Piggy's mom and dad are not around. That he's lived with his aunt for a period of time, and so. The next scene that I want to talk about, again, if you have this version, is on page 9, which is that Piggy tells Ralph, we may be here until we die. Nobody knows that we are actually here. And it's not until Piggy actually says that to Ralph that Ralph realizes, oh shoot, this is a really serious situation that we're in. So Ralph goes from being incredibly carefree, my father is in the Navy, he'll probably save us, the excitement of being on his own and being free with no authoritative figures around, to Piggy being like, I think you need to kind of understand that nobody knows that we're here, that we may be here for a long time. And then as Ralph is swimming, he's like, shoot, you're right. We may actually be here for a long time. And then pay attention to what happens. What is the first thing that Ralph asks for? His clothes. He wants to put his clothes back on. He commands Piggy, get my clothes, which again kind of illustrates to us that leader-follower relationship or superior-inferior relationship. He doesn't say, please, can you do me a favor and grab my clothes? He says to Piggy, get my clothes over there. Again, which really kind of solidifies, and clarifies that relationship, at least for the moment. And Piggy happily does it. He goes over and he grabs Ralph's clothes and he brings them over to him. Says, get my clothes. And then, again, to solidify my point here about civility and the clothing and what that really represents, it says, to put on a gray shirt once more was strangely pleasing. Right? Because now it's that comfort of having clothes on. It's that reconnection back to civilization. I'm going to put my clothes back on and reconnect myself to civilization. So I hope that makes sense, because that's a really crucial point here, this idea of being away from civilization and what that can do to us as humans. So yeah, there's that dynamic again between Ralph and Piggy of, in terms of superior and inferior and follower and leader. And you're going to see that kind of permeate throughout the novel, except in the first few pages, Ralph, Golding doesn't really paint Ralph with a good picture of Ralph. He actually seems like not a nice person, but we're going to come to really like Ralph throughout the novel. But this first chapter, he doesn't seem like he's treating Piggy all that well. Okay, so that's a lot of below the surface information. Let's move forward now to where they find the conch. And so a conch, as you can see here, is a shell. It's very beautiful. It's usually decorative. You put it on a shelf, or you kind of put it on display in your home. They're really, really beautiful, as you can see here. And it's the one that you see in the PowerPoint here is described similar to the one in the novel, which is this very nice creamy color with touches of pink and so on. It's very, very beautiful. And you're going to want to pay attention to the color because that will change over the course of the novel. So that's something to pay attention to as well. So as Piggy and Ralph, who is now clothed, is walking along, they encounter the shell. Now Piggy recognizes it and recognizes what it can be used for. Ralph doesn't. Ralph just wants it because it's really beautiful and he wants to hold it. But Piggy recognizes what it can be used for, which is to blow into one end of it, and it makes this loud booming sound, and hopefully that will call the others to arrive and assemble. And Piggy can't blow into it because of his asthma, so he gives it to Ralph, and he kind of teaches Ralph, blow from the diaphragm, and teaches him how to blow into it, and it works. And it works. Eventually, Ralph gets the hang of it, and he ends up blowing into the conch for quite some time. And little by little, the boys start to assemble. So all the boys that are, for whatever reason, scattered all over the place, kind of assemble one by one. I think Johnny is one of the first boys that arrives, and Ralph here is standing on this kind of platform area, which is going to end up being the area where he's going to have the assemblies. So he's kind of on this naturally made platform area, and the rest of the boys are going to kind of assemble in front of him. So he's kind of elevated a little bit, and the rest of the boys will assemble down below, and that's going to be important in a moment. And so boys start to assemble, and they start congregating kind of in front of Ralph, and just kind of waiting for him to kind of start the assembly, and so that the boys together can make a bit of a plan. Now, what you will also notice, of course, is that there is a group of boys. It says that they're marching approximately in step in two parallel lines, and they approach as well. So there's Ralph up on the platform, a great number of boys kind of assembled in front of him, and then out in the distance there are these boys that arrive, and being led by one boy, red hair, wearing a cap, I think a gold badge on his cap. The rest of the boys are dressed in cloaks and what's called a ham bone frill, this kind of decorative piece around their neck, and they arrive. And this is really the next kind of key piece of of information, which is we're introduced to our third really key character in this novel, which is a character by the name of Jack, and you're going to hear him being referred to as Meridew in this chapter. For the rest of the novel, he will be referred to as Jack, but some of the boys refer to him as Meridew because that's Jack's last name, and it indicates a sign of respect, like what you would do for, if you're a child or a teenager, how you would refer to an adult. But eventually it'll change to just Jack. And there's a lot of really key pieces of information that you would need to know. But one of the things that I wanted to focus on is first of all who these boys are. So the leader of these boys is Jack Meridew. The rest of the boys, of course, all go to school together. They're all dressed in the exact same way, and they are a choir. And Jack is what is referred to as head boy. He's kind of the leader of their choir. And so they all know each other. And so when Jack has led his choir to the platform where Ralph is blowing into the conch, what you'll notice is some very, very subtle actions from Jack that indicate very early on that Jack is going to be a problem. So we know Ralph pretty well at this point. We know Piggy pretty well at this point. And now we're introduced to Jack. And so some things that you should know about Jack, and when I'm talking about, very subtle actions, is everybody is able to assemble really nicely in front of Ralph. Jack, however, you notice what he does. He vaults onto the platform. He gets into Ralph's face, right? Talk about proximity between characters. He gets into Ralph's face. He's looking down on him. When you look down on somebody, that means that you think that you are better than them, right? So he's looking down at Ralph like, who are you? And he kind of screws up his face, right? Like, who are you? So there's a lot of things, without even Jack opening his mouth, there's a lot of actions that Jack does that indicate he's going to be a problem. Because first of all, he can't even follow a simple action like assembling like everybody else. As a teacher, what I attribute that to is, on the first day of class, everybody's able to come in, take their seat, take their stuff out, get ready to learn. If a student walks through the class and instead of having a seat like everybody else, comes to the front of the class, maybe gets in my face, doesn't even say anything, just can't seem to follow direction like everybody else, I know that's going to be a problem. Okay? Because socially you can't follow the same direction as everybody else. And so we already know that, again, Golding has done a really beautiful thing here with Jack's character without Jack having to say anything. We know Jack is going to be a problem. Good. There's, again, like I said, this chapter is just, it's so chock full of really below the surface pieces of information where if you blink or you're not an educated reader, you're going to miss it. And so when Jack arrives and he vaults onto the platform and he gets in Ralph's face and everything, Jack is wondering, where is the man? Where is an adult? In fact, he doesn't even say adult. He asks specifically for a man, and that's maybe attributed to the time period. But he's asking specifically for a man. Where is the man with the trumpet? Who has called us all together? And Ralph says, actually, it was me. I called everybody together. We're actually about to have a meeting. Why don't you come and why don't you sit down? Why don't you join us? And pay attention to what happens here. The choir, Jack's choir, actually begin to scatter and start to join the meeting. And Jack tells them to stand still. Now, why is that? Jack asks his choir to stand still because, and this is very almost kind of intuitive, and manipulative too, is Jack does not want to relinquish control of his choir. This is such a subtle thing, but it gives us such a grand indication of the kind of person that Jack is. Think of it this way, if you're having difficulty following. If Jack allows the choir, his choir, to listen to Ralph and sit, it's not going to take very long for his choir to eventually start seeing Ralph as an authoritative figure, as somebody to listen to. And Jack is thinking to himself, this is my choir. If they're going to sit, I'm going to be the one to tell them to sit. So you don't tell them to sit, I will tell them. So when Ralph says, we're having a meeting, why don't you come and sit? And everybody starts to sit. Jack's like, no. Hold on a second, choir, you stand still. And they're begging Jack to be able to sit because, of course, they're so tired. And of course, in the heat of the sun, they want to be able to take their cloaks off and kind of make themselves more comfortable. And for whatever reason, Jack is making them wear it. Two things happen at the bottom of, again, page 16, if you have this version. At the bottom of page 16 here, we notice that a character faints. And so very quickly, because I'll come back to this later, the character that faints is a boy by the name of Simon. And you will want to have a whole page set up for Simon, because you're going to keep coming back and making notes about this young boy who we are going to come to love. And he's just such a beautifully created character by William Golding. So make a note to yourself. His name is Simon, and your first note can be the boy who faints, because he is a boy who collapses later on in a further PowerPoint or video. You'll come to understand why he does. But you won't find that out until much later. But he's a boy who is constantly fainting, to the point where Jack says he is always fainting, just like he did in Jib and Addie. And these are very posh ways of referring to two places. One is Gibraltar, and the other one is Addis Ababa. And this is a very subtle hint from William Golding as to where the boys are heading. Where was their plane going? If you follow the line from Britain and Gibraltar and Addis Ababa, you may get the flight path of where these boys were going, because Gibraltar and Addis Ababa are two very popular fueling stations. So you may get an indication of where this plane was going. Simon, he faints. The boys kind of help him up. Now, moving forward a little bit, of course, Piggy steps forward and Piggy says, we're in the middle of taking everybody's names, and Piggy tries to kind of recap who's who and so on. And then we get a really good verbal indication of the kind of person that Jack is, because, again, Jack doesn't even know who Piggy is, has never met him before. They don't have any prior relationship. And Jack says this to Piggy: "You're talking too much. Shut up, fatty." So that's our first indication in the novel of verbal bullying. Somebody picking on Piggy for his weight. And that tells us everything that we need to know about Jack, doesn't it? Right? So we got some actions from Jack that indicate that he's going to be a problem, and now we've got some verbal indications that Jack is really not a nice person. And this is where Ralph steps in, and I am a firm believer that Ralph is not trying to further embarrass Piggy, but actually try and come to his aid. You can read it differently if you want to. This is just my interpretation, because Ralph steps in and says his name is not Fatty, his name is Piggy. And everybody starts to laugh. And of course, Piggy is embarrassed. He's hurt because he told Ralph, "So long as you don't tell the others." And what does Ralph do? He goes and he tells the others. Again, my personal belief is that Ralph steps forward and actually tries to come to Piggy's rescue, right? Don't call him Fatty, call him Piggy. And it's, of course, it just kind of backfires, and it ends up being a really embarrassing moment for Piggy. Everybody starts to call him Piggy. Everybody starts to laugh, and Piggy is incredibly hurt. And of course, if you haven't picked up on it already, what you notice about Piggy is that he's a very meek and mild kind of a character. He's somebody that, he gets agitated quickly and he can be a little bit annoying, but he's mostly a very kind of mild character, and he finds the aggressiveness and the tone of Jack very intimidating. Just to see that dynamic between Jack and Piggy, it makes you feel bad for Piggy a little bit. And this is where that relationship, of course, will start to grow between Ralph and Piggy a little bit, despite the fact that in this particular scene, Piggy is not too happy with Ralph. Okay. Again, what you notice from this chapter is the boys do a really smart thing, which is they elect a chief. Jack wants to be chief. He makes his case for it. He says, I'm already a leader in my own respect, right? He says, I'm head boy, right? So that makes a lot of sense, actually, that, for Jack, he's saying, I'm already a proven leader, right? I lead my choir, so why can't I lead the bigger group of boys? He also says he can sing a C sharp. I don't know what that has to do with being a leader, but okay. And so he makes a really good case for himself. It's interesting because aside from the choir, who only raise their hands wearily obedient to Jack, only voting for Jack because they feel like they should, everybody else votes for Ralph. And this is where we see a bit of a turn in Ralph's character, where we go from, how he treats Piggy to actually kind of understanding who Ralph is as a character, because a really key takeaway about Ralph is that they vote for Ralph not just because he's the one that assembled them all together, but because there's something in his face that just kind of indicates that he is a good person. There's a mildness about his mouth, eyes that proclaim no devil, right? So we know that he is a character with really good intentions. And so that's where, for starting from here, we can really start to kind of see the kind of character that Ralph is going to be. What we do find interesting, and I'll just point this out really quickly, is that as the boys are voting for a chief, Piggy does not vote for Jack, of course. Just finished calling him Fatty. And Piggy also does not initially vote for Ralph. Two things. Number one, maybe Piggy doesn't vote for Ralph because he's still upset that Ralph has just outed his nickname. So he could be upset with Ralph. The other reason could be that Piggy also thought, hey, maybe I'm in the running as well to be leader. So what we come to understand is that Jack is somebody that is aggressive, intimidating. We know he's going to be a problem. And there's a scene coming up that further indicates that, in case you still don't believe me. Ralph is kind of the average everyman. If you think of him as a leader and a politician, he's the everyman. He's the one of the people, right? He's going to be democratic in nature. But Piggy's the intellectual, right? And so so Piggy thinks that his intellect is going to be enough to garner some respect, and maybe even the boys will vote for him. When Piggy sees that people are either going to vote for Jack or vote for Ralph, then of course he votes for Ralph. And Ralph ends up, of course, becoming chief. He becomes leader, and they have that settled. So that's a really important piece of building civilization, which is to have an implementing voice. And why shouldn't it be Ralph? So, like I said, there's a scene coming up here that kind of indicates, again, Jack's aggressiveness. Because Ralph, at 12 years old, does a really smart thing here. What Ralph does is he turns to Jack, realizing that Jack really wanted to be leader. Ralph turns to Jack and asks him, or tells him, first of all, you are in charge of your choir. I'm not going to take them away from you. You are in charge of them. What do you want them to be? We obviously don't need a choir on the island. So what do you want them to be? This is really, really smart, because this is a way for Ralph, whether he realizes it or not, to keep Jack on his side. I think Ralph realizes this kid's going to be a problem. I got to keep him close, right? I got to keep him on my side for as long as possible. And a way to do that, of course, is by allowing Jack to have some control, right? And have control over his choir. Think of how things would go if Ralph was like, okay, your choir is now mine, right? That's not going to go over very well. So the scene that I'm talking about is Ralph asks Jack, what do you want them to be? And do you see what Jack initially says? He wants them to be an army, a military. Not only is that silly because they're a bunch of boys, but there's no one else there. And it's also an army and a military is not a necessary component of life right now. It's not what they need. So you can already see where Jack's mind has gone, which is, okay, what do I want to turn them into? Something really aggressive. So why? So that gives us an indication of kind of where Jack's head is at. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. Jack is smart and manipulative in a lot of ways, but this scene here is more of a call out to his aggressiveness. And he's not thinking straight. So Ralph is forced to step in and correct him. And so Ralph says, like, do you mean hunters? Do you want to turn them into hunters, like people to gather food? Because that makes more sense, of course. So that's what they will be turned into. So Jack's choir will be turned into hunters. That makes more sense than anything else. Okay, skipping forward again to the expedition that Ralph is going to go on. Ralph is going to go on an expedition. He's going to go on an adventure. He's going to go and try and figure out whether or not they are on an island. And the reason why this expedition is so important is because if they're on an island, they are screwed, especially if it's a deserted island, which it is. If it's not an island, it means that they're attached to mainland somewhere. Therefore, they are, in proximity, in distance, maybe a far distance, but at least they're in proximity to other human beings, and they can find civilization eventually. So it's really important for them to figure out, are we attached to mainland or is this an island? And of course, they're going to figure out in a moment that it is in fact an island. So Ralph has decided, I'm going to go on this expedition, find out if it's an island. What makes the most sense is not to just walk around, because if you are attached to mainland, you're going to be walking forever. So the most logical thing is to go straight up. So there's a mountain on this island. They're going to climb the mountain, go to the very top, and just look out. Go and look around and see if they are surrounded by water. And that's exactly what they're going to do. Now, Ralph decides he's going to take Jack. It's only going to be 3 boys in total. So Ralph is going to go. He decides to also take Jack with him, which I think is also very smart. Again, keeps him kind of close, gives him some responsibility. And the third boy that he takes is Simon, the boy who just finished fainting. So the question, of course, is why? And what I keep coming back to, and I've read this novel many, many, many times, is Ralph is giving Simon an opportunity here to redeem himself. He just finished fainting. Jack just finished kind of outing him as somebody that faints all the time. What a burden. He's always doing this. So it's almost like Ralph is giving Simon an opportunity to redeem himself, to be a part of something like this expedition, to kind of redeem yourself in the eyes of the boys and kind of gain back their respect maybe. And so the 3 of them are going to go on this expedition. And so I'll fast forward a little bit, and on this expedition, we know that Piggy is left behind, as you can see on the slide here, right? That Piggy wants to go along on this trip, and Piggy, says, I was with Ralph before anybody else was. I deserve to kind of go on this. Deserve to go on this expedition, and Ralph tells him, go back and take names, and that's going to be go back and take names, and that's going to be your job. And that's when Piggy confronts Ralph about telling everybody his nickname. Piggy actually says to Ralph, as Ralph is getting ready to leave on this expedition, you told them. I told you not to tell them about my name, and you went and you told them. And Ralph feels kind of bad. He half apologizes and half kind of brushes it off. He's like, I'm really sorry. And I'm sorry that you feel that way. and then of course tells Piggy to go back and take names. I knew this one was going to be long. Folks. But there's a lot of information. Fast forward again. We're almost done, I promise. Fast forward again to the boys, Jack, Ralph, and Simon. They're making their way to the top of the mountain. We don't know what the other boys are doing. When they're climbing the mountain, they get to this scene where they recognize footprints. And it's tracks made from an animal, not from humans, because like I said, we're going to find out that this island is deserted. There are no other humans, but there are animals, and they do encounter animal tracks. So that's really important to know, because if they're the tracks of pigs or a boar or anything like that, there is meat, right, to eat. So that's really important moving forward. As they continue to make their way up, the three boys see this boulder that is kind of teetering on the cliff here, and they decide to push it off. And this is one of those scenes where, again, if you're kind of an uneducated reader, you're not well practiced, then you'll see the scene as nothing more than boys being boys, right? They see a big rock and they're going to push it off of the cliff like maybe anybody would do. But the description of it says that it smashed a deep hole in the canopy of the forest. And so this is really a call out, and what Golding is doing here is kind of showing us little pieces of what happens when you introduce humanity into a really beautiful area. You have this deserted island, which is, if you're paying attention to the description, I don't focus on it a lot, but if you focus on the description of just the red birds and the vibrant colors, the green bushes as they're making their way through the forest, it's a really, really lush and beautiful island. You have the swimming pool, that's a beautiful temperature, and so on. It's a really, really beautiful place, untouched by humans. But as soon as you introduce humans, as soon as the boys land on the island, what do? Their plane creates a scar. You probably saw that term used a lot in this chapter. The plane creates a scar in the island. And now you have this boulder that has smashed a deep hole in the canopy of the forest. Untouched by humanity, beautiful place. You introduce humanity to it. You've got a scar now. If you picture the island as a face, it's now got a scar on it and smashed a deep hole into it as well. So it's a really, really subtle point that Golding is making about, you introduce, humanity into an untouched, beautiful place, and this is what they do to it. Over time, they destroy it. The boys make their way to the top of the mountain. They look around. They find out what they need to find out, which is they look around. They realize, yes, we are surrounded by water. This is an island, and there doesn't appear to be anybody else on it. As you'll see at the beginning of chapter 2, it's described for us. There are no houses, no footprints, no boat, no people, no smoke. There's nothing that indicates that anybody else exists on this island, that they are, in fact, alone, which is important, of course. So I believe there's only 2 other scenes that I wanted to focus on, and then I promise we are done, which is as soon as they figure out, of course, that they are on an island and that is confirmed, they now just want to leave the top of the mountain and go back to the rest of the boys and let them know what they have seen, which of course happens at the beginning of chapter 2. What I wanted to focus your attention on is our 2 remaining scenes. And that is, if you have this version on page 28, right at the end of the chapter there, it's a very, very, very brief scene between Simon and Jack. Simon here sees these aromatic green bushes. And Simon is a character, and you can add this to the list of things that we're eventually going to add to Simon's character. Simon is somebody that is a boy who's incredibly sensitive in nature, and sensitive in nature, and wants to connect with nature. So when he encounters these bushes that are aromatic, they smell really nice, they're beautiful to look at, he wants to go over and he wants to inspect them and smell them and kind of connect with nature a little bit. And that's really, really bizarre for, if you picture, Simon's, ideally a 12-year-old boy, for a 12-year-old boy to be to be like that, as opposed to sort of boisterous and aggressive. He's somebody that's actually quite sensitive, and that's a call out to his character. As he goes over and he goes to smell these little candle buds, and he goes over to smell them and kind of just get wrapped up in the beauty of them. And that says some things about Simon's character. What does Jack do in that exact same scene? Like I said, it's a very, very brief scene. If you blink, you miss it. Jack comes over, he has a little pocket knife. He takes his pocket knife and he cuts into the flowers. And he says, you can't eat them, so why are you wasting time? Let's go. And that's a call to Jack's character. The aggressiveness of not even just tapping Simon on the shoulder and being like, hey, we gotta go. But to actually take out his little pocket knife and cut into the flower like that, that shows aggressiveness. So it's such a small scene, but it tells us everything that we need to know about Simon, everything that we need to know about Jack. So on the one hand, of course, you have Simon wanting to really connect with nature here, and you're going to see that as part of the makeup of Simon's character, this idea of kind of connecting with nature, being on his own, being reflective. And then Jack comes over, takes out his little pocket knife and cuts into the flower, which shows his aggressiveness, and certainly the fact that Jack doesn't have any kind of connection to nature. He's not working on the same depth that Simon is. So I hope that makes sense. And then, of course, the last scene that I wanted to focus on, which is really important, is as they're making their way down the mountain, is they do encounter a trapped piglet, as you can see on this slide here. If you look really, really closely, you can see the little vines, and then you can see a little pig snout there. And so, they encounter this kind of trapped piglet who is squealing, can't tear itself loose. And Jack takes out his little pocket knife, getting ready to make his first kill. And he puts his arm up like this, and he's getting ready, and he hesitates, and he hesitates, and he hesitates. And the little trapped piglet is able to finally tear itself loose, and it runs off. And Jack's arm kind of comes down, and that's it. And so, of course, the question is why? Why does he hesitate? And it shouldn't escape you that there is still some civility left inside of Jack, that he can't bring himself to harm and kill a little trapped piglet. And so even though Jack is a really aggressive boy, and we've come to see how intimidating he can be and how rude he can be, there's still some civility left in him. He just can't bring himself to do it. And if you think of the background of these boys, these ideally private school, British boys, how much killing of an animal has Jack done in his life back home? Probably none. So doing this is it's not going to be easy, especially the first time. So he brings his knife out, he's getting ready to do it, and inside of himself, he just can't bring himself to do it. His mind is still too connected to civility from back home. And that's just going to eat away. That's just going to eat away at Jack, because he doesn't want that sitting with him. He kind of sees it as cowardly, as opposed to actually seeing this scene as kind of like nice, where you're looking at Jack being like, wow, he's got some civility left in him. He sees it himself as actually being quite cowardly, and it eats away at him until eventually he does get his first kill. But that's not for a few chapters. So that's chapter 1 of Lord of the Flies, and I know that it's a lot of information, but that's how deep the rabbit hole goes. And that's why you do a classic like this, and that's why I have such a difficult time replacing a novel like this with something maybe more current or something like that, or more modern, because the depth of this novel is just absolutely outstanding. And it's a great novel to teach students how to read. That you're not just reading for surface level information. You've probably heard from a very young grade to read between the lines. I call that below the surface information. that you're given a lot of information on the surface, but there's a lot of information that you have to figure out for yourself. And there's nuances to certain scenes and things like that, that over time, the more you read, of course, the better reader you will become. And it's the same thing with writing. You can only become a better writer by writing a lot. So that's how deep the rabbit hole goes. And that's just the start of it. The novel gets very, very deep, as you'll see with the upcoming video reviews. So I hope you found it helpful, and already you should have a copious amount of notes for this chapter alone. So it is really important to take notes and keep yourself as organized as possible. So until next time.
The second that you told me that story, and I just can't stop thinking about the way he was loving you. I was playing the